Hinge Center for the Arts in Independence, Kansas. It was the home of the playwright William Hinge for 13 years or so. And I was always looking for different Kansas subject matter that I might be able to get funding for to create things. And as I wrote in the program note, I stumbled on part of Eisenhower's Cross of Iron speech in a little Facebook post in, I think, 2011. And I looked at it and I went, Eisenhower said this? I thought of him like everyone my age and younger, that I didn't know anything about him, other than that he'd been the leader in World War II, and he'd been president during the Leave It to Beaver years, and that my parents had voted against him because they were good Democratic liberals, and then my father had fought, he not landed on D-Day, but a couple of months after. And so I went, he said this very anti-war sentiment, and so I went and found the whole speech, and I read the whole speech and went, wow, that's an amazing speech. So I started to go and look at other things, and since he was a Kansas figure, I went, somebody must have done a play about him. Maybe we could do the play here. And I started to do a search. Nobody had written a play about him. In fact, you can hardly find him as a character in any plays or movies, in a few. And so I went, wow, what a great opportunity. And my first call was to Richard Hellesen, who was on vacation in Yosemite and without his phone, and said, what do you think about this? Because Richard is he's an associate artist at Ford's Theater in Washington. He's written a number of plays that are based on history, and he's somehow able to magically turn them from dry history into characters who do things. And so I will throw it to him, and I left a message on his machine.
Yes, he did. And I happen to love history. I've just always, ever since I was a kid, I've loved American history, my favorite subject. And somehow I fell into theater. That's a whole other story. But he said, play about Eisenhower. And I knew probably more than you did, but in order to begin to research it, exactly the same problem came up. It's vast. There is so much. We've joked throughout the whole process it could be 9 hours long. What's the approach? So the first thing I started doing a bunch of research, and one of the things I did was drive out to Abilene. I went out to the library, borrowed your car, and drove out to Abilene. Spent a couple days out there. Did not go to the Greyhound Museum, but I did go across the street. Spent a little time and doing some digging and some research, and I came back and I said, this is so huge and it's so great, it's a great topic. The only way I think this could possibly work might possibly be as a one-person show, because I don't know how you would begin to have a multi-character play that could boil it all down. But then the question becomes, and I've never written a one-person show before, they are extremely hard. They are extremely hard to write, primarily because you have to explain why they're talking. That's the dramatist's question. Okay, it's not the historian's question, it's the dramatist's question. Why are they talking? So my historian head and my dramatist head were doing this a great deal. And I suppose you always fall back on the question that history plays need to be plays first. They need to work dramatically, not just historically. But at the same time, you've got to be fair to history. Okay, so how do we do that? And I was lucky enough, the first two books I read were Letters to a Friend, Ike's Letters to Sweet Hazlitt. And my first thought was maybe something with the two of them. And then I read At Ease, which was really my primary source. As you could probably tell from the play, there's so many things I borrowed from At Ease. Because it's personal. It's telling stories that we didn't really know about his life. And somewhere along the way, I stumbled, I know what it was. It was the third book, was Going Home to Glory. It was David Eisenhower's Going Home to Glory. It was the third book I read, because it was looking at his post-presidency. And I came across the fact that poll came out in 1962, and he was ranked 22nd. At that point, I went, that's my hook. Okay, because now I have a reason. I have a dramatic reason for him to talk, because now he has to be able to go back and defend himself, or what if they're right? It gives me a reason to let him track back and re-examine some things, and it would allow me to boil it down to an hour and a half on the stage. Okay, so that's how those two things met. But it was finding that lucky break of finding that the New York Times thing.
Because prior to that, we had talked about it. We said it, maybe because we wanted him past his presidency so that he could talk about his whole presidency. We'd thrown around ideas of maybe during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we were throwing out, like, how do we get this? And there would be all those great conversations earlier in his career, but then you miss everything later in his career. And so it was a...
And then the final piece was, in 2013, I guess it was, my wife and I went to Gettysburg to visit the battlefield, and while we were there, we toured the house. And seriously, my wife back there, hello, she'll tell you, the minute that I walked onto the porch, I went, this is where it happens. Okay. So now we have we have a historical thing, a dramatic thing, and a scenic thing that all merge. And then the final piece is you get the genius actor, and you're good. Right? That's the process in a nutshell.
Yeah, it only took 12 years.
Only took 12 years.
So I noticed that a lot of the photographs that you showed tonight were from the archives of the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. And you had mentioned that you had come to Abilene to conduct some research.
Yeah.
So give us a sense of how important conducting that research was with those primary source artifacts and materials were to this project.
Well, the sort of maybe my part of the gimmick was when he talked about the porch, we talked about how do we explain the things he's talking about to a younger audience that's not going to know any of the references. And so we thought we could kill, as he says, like two birds with one stone. One is that we can provide context through some of those. And the other is that we give the audience a chance to get their eyes off of Ike and look at something else so they can come back fresh. Because a lot of fatigue happens when you're staring at one person for a long time. So if we gave them something visual to look at and come back, now we can support the play with it. And the big worry, and Joe Huppert, our brilliant projection designer who's up there.
There's Joe and all the projections.
He came on. When did you come on? You came on about 2 years ago also, didn't you? Yeah. And we talked about that we knew the projections could be supportive, and the fear is that they're going to overwhelm the actor. And so we wanted to keep them in a supporting role, and the idea was that we wanted to present what Ike might be thinking about, not to present every little thing that he talks about, but what he might be spurring him to think about or remember, and to show that to the audience, what's going on in his head, so that Richard didn't have to explain every single thing.
And then we'll open it up to some questions from you all, but I have one more question that I wanted for John, but he's not here. So maybe you all can give me a sense of, you had mentioned finding the perfect person to portray Eisenhower, and you chose John. So tell me what went into that and why him?
Oh, well, I think John chose us. No, seriously, because we all live in California, thank you, and we were going to do a reading in LA with another actor that he knew who was unavailable. And you knew John from previous theater, right?
John had been out to Kansas a couple of times for the Inch Festival, and then he and I had both run theaters at around the same time in Los Angeles, so we knew, we bounced around together, and so I just called him. I think I sent him a Facebook message and said, would you by any chance be open to maybe coming and reading this play? We didn't even know whether we had a play yet. It was just
the script was about the size of those encyclopedias over there.
We'd never heard it, and we just wanted a good actor to read it so we could see whether there was a play there. And I think he read it once and I've actually been kind of looking. And so we set up a time and we rented a little space, and I found someone to read the stage directions, and he came in and blew us away with his first reading. And he seemed to fall in love with it as well. And he said, yeah, I think I'd like to work on this. And we realized it was way too long and there was all sorts of stuff to do to it. But he said, but I'm going off to New York to do a play. But once we open, if you guys wanted to come out there, we could workshop it out here. So we both came out here to New York right after his play opened. And for 10 days, we sat in a room working on the script and doing it. And then we came actually to this very theater and did a reading for an invited audience of about 35 people. And Anne was there, and Stephen Hauge was there, and a number of theater people. And we didn't know how it was going to respond. And then one, they laughed, they had a good response to it. I mean, the script is much tighter now, but it sparked such a conversation afterwards. I mean, a really lively, thoughtful conversation, and we received way more encouragement than we ever thought we would. And so we were all excited to continue working on it. So we went on, did one more reading of it in San Diego about 5 months later, with an audience that actually paid a little money to come to the reading, and they burst into spontaneous applause in a couple of places during the script. And then again, they had to talk back for 45 minutes. We had to kick them out of the theater. They didn't want to leave. They just wanted to talk about what it meant, and everybody had their own take on it and how it applied. So we knew we had something.
All right, well, thank you. All right, let's open it up for your questions, if anyone has any other questions. Yes.
I'm a child of the 60s, and I'm curious why you did not touch on two things that Eisenhower gave my generation. One was Richard Nixon, twice, and the other was the Vietnamese War indirectly. Why did you omit those two subjects?
Well, I mean, you can answer it right now. So it's 1962 that we set the play. So he's talking about what's going on right then. So he talks about what had just recently happened with Nixon, which was losing to Kennedy, and then he also mentions the mess in Southeast Asia, but it hadn't blown up yet. And we were, in fact, earlier on, we didn't even mention Nixon because we didn't want Nixon's associated with the 70s and Watergate more than anything.
Right.
And we thought, we don't want to take the audience in that direction. So we didn't have him, and then Richard decided that we really can't leave him out there. Too many people go, well, why didn't you mention Nixon? So he gave him a little bit in the first act, so we could he gets a nice laugh out of it, and their relationship was complicated, and many of you probably know more about it than I do, certainly.
And it is a really tricky line, because I'm sort of a child in the 60s too. I was born in 56, but my coming of age was very much, when Nixon Watergate was when I was in high school levels. And I just missed the Vietnam War by about that, so I know exactly what you're talking about. And it's a tricky challenge in a play to decide how much you're going to go in a certain direction for that character at that point. And because if you do go that way, then now you really got to do it. You've got to really be honest and do it. And so part of me is exactly with you on that. It's like, God, it's the writer. What do I do? How do I handle this? And what would he do in that point? One thing I will say is that I think we at least tried at various points to have him fess up to the things he did that were not tenable, that were mistakes. I probably made more mistakes than we'd have him do in the play. I remember going back and reading Give Him Hell, Harry by Samuel Gowan, which was done in 1976. So I read every one-person play there was to read, right, to see how do you do this. And the thing I came away with Give Him Hell, Harry is it felt very, very polishy about Harry Truman. It's maybe one of the reasons I wanted to put the stuff in about how Truman was going to be all about desegregating the military, only he really didn't do it. Okay, he gets the credit for it. Right. But it's a great question, it really is, and it's a tough question to answer about how far in any direction do you go, both historically, to be historically true and honest, right. And what that character would do at that point.
And at the same time, other people have brought up, well, what about some of the things that now look like they were big mistakes, potentially, like Iran?
Yeah,
right. But at the time, the Shah had just done a major tour. It looked like a gigantic success at that moment when we're doing the play. Right. So why would he be critical of it or anything? I mean, so there's it's tough when you pick a time period. You be truthful with the time period, or you do a revisionist thing. So I think Richard did a good job, mostly of putting nods in to things that were possibilities. The other is that he's talking to his editor and ostensibly the historians, and so what is he going to say to them? And so that's another thing that goes into the thinking of it.
And just to kind of finish that point, to the extent that anybody comes away from this and says, you know, what I got to go do is get a book on this and read it and find out more. I think that's all to the good, you know, because there's going to be books that are pro, books that are anti, books that are somewhere in between. If anybody is inspired to go out and say, I want to know more about this and learn those things that you're talking about, now I hope that would happen.
My second question is, again, having grown up in part in the Eisenhower era and seeing him on TV, how did John decide how to depict him on stage?
It's a better question for John, but we all decided early on that we didn't want to try and do an impersonation. That all you're going to be doing is then comparing him to him.
Right.
So, you know, right away, John doesn't look that much like Ike. You know, we did the hair to at least give a sense of that. John's slighter than Ike is, so, you know. So it was really about how do you try and find the essence of it and make it so that the audience can relate to him. And John had to use what John has to do that. One of the reasons that I thought he was such a good actor for it is because John has an incredible warmth and humanity about him, which if you then put a sort of a military or, you know, tough bearing on it, it still comes through. And that I thought was really important, that when he's angry, you don't just get anger, you get a whole full three-dimensional person underneath. And John can't not have that humanity within him, no matter how angry he gets, and it really is apparent. One of his great strengths as an actor is you really feel like you get to know him. And we were very lucky. We were very lucky that he chose to do it, and it was a dream. Richard and I had worked together many times before, but neither of us had worked with John. And it was a dream being able to, all three of us in the room, we really set our egos aside and tried to work to make the show the best. And whoever had the best idea at that time, we really tried to do it. We had to cut so many great things that Richard had written, stories from Ike's life, as we tried to pare it down, because it's a great story, but where does it go? What does it replace? How do you move it off to the side? And there were a few things that went in and went out, went in and went out. And we don't talk about Churchill at all, and we had quite a relationship with Churchill, but it was going to slow things down.
I think we have one more question over here. No? All right, any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Besides the fact that a lot of people don't know that much about Ike, at least in my generation, why else do you think it's important for the younger generations to see a play like this?
Would I be slightly off if I were to suggest that you were perhaps in some way distantly related? Distantly related?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, I asked, besides the fact that a lot of people don't know that much about Ike, at least in my generation, why else would it be important for people of my age to watch this play? Like, what can you take away from it?
I think we have that in mind quite consistently through the process. That question kept coming up a lot. What if you don't remember? What if you know, and my kids are in their 30s, right? They don't remember any of this. And I think what we were probably after was the larger thematic issues that I think still do resonate about what is important, about what the values are, that are relevant now without my having to come right out and tell you, if you know what I mean. I think there's a lot of, we're trying very consciously to say, how can we talk about now without specifically talking about now?
You got your show